Good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of Bellarmine Chapel, we're very happy that so many have come. Special welcome to the students who are here. And I'm here to introduce our main speaker, Joanna Williams. Joanna is the Director of Education and Advocacy at the Kino Border Initiative, which is a work, an apostolate, a ministry in Nogales, Arizona, but also has a place in Sonora, Mexico. She's a graduate from Georgetown University, and prior to her current position, has journeyed with immigrants in a variety of contexts. She's volunteered at a shelter in Tierra Blanca, Veracruz, conducted Fulbright research on the reintegration of deported and returned immigrants, and has worked as a coordinator for the American Civil Liberties Union's Border Litigation Project. That's a mouthful, Joanna, but it's very impressive. We're delighted to have Joanna with us. She spent part of her day after arriving this morning in Cincinnati. She was at St. Xavier High School, and she's here with us this evening to share her experiences and her reflections. So I introduce to you and welcome Joanna Williams.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to have the opportunity to reflect together on what does it mean to live the Eucharist at the border. And I would argue, or I believe, that when we say living the Eucharist at the border, we have this really unique opportunity to live the depth of Christ's presence in a variety of different ways. Because obviously God has promised that His Spirit would be with us, that He accompanies us in every moment of our lives. But Jesus also made very particular promises of where He would be present. He made a very particular promise of real presence in the Eucharist. And that's something that we as Catholics believe and hold fast to. And He also made, when He was prophesying about the Judgment Day and looking back, He pointed out His presence in the face of our brother and sister migrants, saying that I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So in a beautiful way, Jesus is pointing us to how He is embodied in a special way in the Eucharist and in the border. And it's from that context that I want to speak today, understanding how through our brother and sister migrants can we better understand the Eucharist, can we better understand our faith. And you'll notice that in this context there's a heavy dose of the Jesuit approach as well, bringing, unsurprisingly, as a graduate of Georgetown University and someone who works at Jesuit Works. But those of you who've gone through the exercises or who are starting the exercises here at Bellarmine might recognize that the view that I'll give to the Eucharist also mirrors the journey of the spiritual exercises in the pattern of those 4 weeks. So be attentive to also how Jesus is manifesting Himself in that guide that St. Ignatius has offered to us. Oh, the Eucharist is gone. So it's a bit of an untraditional interpretation of the Last Supper that you've seen on all of the photos and the flyers for this event. But it's one that really embodies and shows this idea of the presence of Jesus in multiple ways. And we'll start in the journey of the Mass and the journey of the Eucharist with this idea of the invitation. So when we attend Mass, the very beginning is this invitation that the Lord be with us. It's a grounding in the tender love that God has shown us. It's a welcoming and hospitality of that tender love. And the person who I think invites us into that is a woman named Juana. She's going to be our guide for this first movement. Juana, this isn't actually a photo of Juana because I don't have a photo of her. All of the other photos are real photos of people who I'll share about. But Juana is an older woman, probably 70 years old, from a small town in Guatemala. And she came to our shelter about 9 months ago. She was dressed very traditionally. She had the long skirts that grandmothers in small towns in Guatemala oftentimes wear. and she'd never left her town before. But her son had gone to the United States, had lived in the US for quite some time, had 2 daughters there, and those 2 daughters then had come back to Guatemala. And her son went back to the United States looking for economic opportunity and security. And Juana's task at that point became trying to bring his 2 daughters, who were both US citizens, back up to him in the United States. So this 70-year-old grandmother, who's never left her town in Guatemala, who doesn't speak Spanish as a first language, she spoke an indigenous language in Guatemala, she's made this journey from Guatemala all the way up to the border with her 2 little granddaughters as an act of incredible love. An incredible love that I would argue reflects the courage and the love that God shows towards us. It's both this tenderness and the strength in Juana's love. And I remember her being in the women's shelter very distinctly for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, Spanish was not her native language. And that did not keep her back from talking at full speed and sharing her experiences with me and her enthusiasm and her welcome and her hospitality, even when I could understand maybe 5% of what she was sharing, which I know for many of us has been an experience, whether we speak primarily Spanish or English or another language. Oftentimes that language barrier seems insurmountable. But for Juana, it wasn't. For Juana, the act of love and the act of hospitality was enough, even if we couldn't understand each other. And the second thing that I remember very distinctly about Juana is, at the point that I had met her, she'd already left her village in Guatemala, she'd already come up to the border, she'd actually gone to the port of entry and presented herself. She thought that she was going to be let in with her granddaughters, but it turns out the US government doesn't recognize grandmothers as legitimate nuclear family. So she was turned back from the border while her US citizen granddaughters were brought in. And that's when she came across our women's shelter. And she talked with this deep concern about her granddaughters, what would happen to them now they were in state custody, would they make it to her son? But she also talked with such tenderness about her brother, who was back in Guatemala, and he had arthritis, and she was his primary caregiver. And she would make these motions showing me how bent over his hands were, how hard it was for him to walk, how difficult the daily tasks were for her brother. And so she was motivated on this incredible journey of love to come all the way up to Nogales. And then she had this sense of urgency to go back, to be able to be with her brother, to love another member of the family, and tenderly take care of him for what probably would be the rest of either his life or her life. And hearing that from Juana grounds me and hopefully grounds us in the sense of belovedness. We are beloved of God, and He loves us with tenderness. He loves us with strength. He loves us with courage, much like Juana loved her and loves her granddaughters, her son, her brother. And it's from that position that we're able to love and we're able to offer hospitality, inspired by that example of hospitality. Because the final incredible thing about Juana is that the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Sonora, has a women's shelter. So in a sense, we were welcoming Juana into our doors to stay there I think she stayed for about 10 days. But when I walked into the women's shelter, even though I'd been there dozens of times before, I felt like Juana was the host. She was welcoming me into her home and making me feel at home there in a space that I'd already been in dozens of times, far more than she had. And so she taught me about receiving hospitality as well, as that essential grounding element at the beginning of Mass, at the beginning of exercises, and really at the root of our faith, is not just to spring into action, to spring into offering hospitality, which this parish and this university have done in incredible ways, but also to recognize in what times and in what moments can we best receive hospitality? In what times and at what moments can we simply sit down at the table with other individuals, a table maybe set by other communities, where we weren't the initiators, but we're just receiving this as a grace, humbly. That's I think, what creates transformation. Within the Jesuits, we have a campaign for hospitality, and one of my favorite phrases in that campaign is that hospitality points to that another world is possible. And that act of both giving and receiving hospitality points us to a vision of the kingdom, points us to a vision of love, and it points us to a vision of Eucharist as well. So that's the starting point for our day, is Juana coming around a table and living with tenderness of love. And then in the Mass, the next movement that we have is we move into this moment of penitence, this moment of confession. I confess for what we've done and what we haven't done. And it's motivated, that confession is motivated in contrast to the incredible grace of God. It's because we believe in God's overwhelming love that we can look at our inadequacies, both personal and structural. And I still mourn and I'm troubled by how sin affected Marisela, whose hands are pictured here. She didn't want her face pictured. Marisela was a woman who experienced many instances of personal sin and many instances of corporate sin or social sin. Marisela was from a small town in Guatemala. She suffered from domestic violence as a kid and then as a wife later on. She was working in a small clothing factory where she didn't make enough to survive. She at that point was a single mom. She couldn't support her daughter because of her work in the clothing factory, clothing that I am probably wearing now, or many of us in this room are wearing. And then she started to receive threats from the gangs in her town that were extorting her and saying that if she couldn't pay the extortion, they would kill her. So she fled up to the border. She came to a town that's a little bit east of where Nogales is. It's called Agua Prieta. And there, she thought that she was going to be smuggled across the border. But instead, the woman who was supposed to be her guide or negotiating with the smugglers tried to traffic her instead. So tried to sell her off to traffickers. And she escaped from that, eventually found her way to our women's shelter, and was in our women's shelter for many months. A church community, much like Bellarmine, offered to receive her. They opened their doors to her. They said, we can sponsor her if she seeks asylum in the US. And she presented herself at the port of entry. But for what are considered single adults at the port of entry, they're automatically put into detention. So Marisela was detained for 6 months in southern Arizona while she was fighting her asylum case. She never got the chance to go to the church that had opened their doors to receive her. She instead lost her asylum case and she was deported, and she arrived in Guatemala about a month ago, or almost 2 months ago now, back to the very reality that she had fled. So Marisela had experienced these moments of personal sin. She experienced these moments of abuse by particular people, by her husband, by her father, abuse by the woman who was intending on trafficking her. But she also in many ways experienced our corporate sin, our social sin, our decision to value cheap material over good working conditions, our decision to invest billions of taxpayer dollars in building detention centers where we hold people like Marisela for months and months. And as much as I want to say, well, I'm opposed to those policies or I'm not involved in that, the reality is that as a citizen of this country, I am, and I'm complicit. And that's part of what we repent for when we confess, when we turn away from evil. Part of what we repent for is that this acknowledgement that we're a part of society that is causing harm. And I have to face that every day when I go across the border and people who are in our shelter, our comedor, or sitting at the port of entry say, but for you it's so easy. But you have your passport. Why is it so easy for you and it's not for me? And that should trouble us. And we should point to that as evil. And that's why it's an important beginning point in the Mass and in the exercises, not just being overwhelmed by grace and love, but also recognizing that we, in a personal way and in a societal way, are not living up to that grace and love. and people like Marisela are suffering as a result. And yet we don't stay there. That's just the first week of the exercises. That's just the opening of the Mass. We move into the liturgy of the Word. We move into, actually, in the very first Eucharist, the moment in which Jesus gets down on his knees and he washes the disciples' feet. He welcomes them in that way, with an example of his ministry. And in the liturgy of the Word, we have these opportunities to hear about Christ's ministry in every single week. And it's an incredible example. I think the person who's going to guide us through this is Rocio. Rocio is a woman from Bolivia who was a victim of trafficking in the United States. And she went and tried to report this to the immigration officials. She thought that it was police. She was a little bit confused. But she went and she said, look, I've been working, they haven't been paying me, I've been exploited. And she said the only thing that they believed was that I had been working. And so they put her in detention for violating the terms of her visa. And she was in immigration detention in southern Arizona for 2 years. Rocio carried so many burdens while she was in immigration detention. She was the only Bolivian in the detention center. She said, no, there was not a single other Bolivian. I still don't know another Bolivian. She was long away from her kids in Bolivia. For many months, her daughters didn't even know where she was. But what's incredible about Rocio, and especially for this second week of the exercises, or second movement, is how she, in the midst of that, was able to minister. She looked around, and she's a little bit older. She's 40 years old. Many of the women who are in detention are in their 20s. And she looked around and she said, well, I could be these women's mothers. And she saw the women who were despairing around her, women who had suicidal thoughts. And she said, well, I'm going to start a prayer group so that we can get together and we can pray and we could read scripture, and that can give hope. Or I'm going to start an arts and crafts club, so that when making these, they would take little pieces of paper and fold them up and make swans and incredible art, so that in that way, I can give hope to some of the women who are around me. So she ministered over the course of her 2 years in detention. As she was worried about her own situation, her own case, she reached out to the people around her, embodying the ministry of Jesus to the marginalized. And then she actually was released from detention. She won a visa for her case after 2 years. And now she's the coordinator of the Detention Visitation Project in Tucson. So she still goes back to detention every single week to go and visit people, to give them words of hope, to say, I know what you're going through because I've been there as well, which is exactly how Jesus lives his public ministry. He's with people because he can know in a profound sense what they're going through. And that allows him to love in a special way. I think sometimes our instinct when it comes to immigration or other areas of our society that cause suffering, the instinct of those of us who have privilege is sometimes to figure out how can we act now? How can we be the ones who serve? But what we do in the Mass and in the exercises is hold back briefly from action. We're not, during the liturgy of the Word, leaving the church. We're not, during the second week of the exercises when we're following Jesus in public ministry, we're not making our plans for how we're going to minister. It's an opportunity to witness how Christ ministers, and in this context, how our brother and sister migrants minister. So looking at them as an example, allowing ourselves to be inspired by the incredible leadership of people in these positions, and then trying to think of what that means for us. So that's the invitation now, is to stand in admiration of how Christ is showing his grace in the world. And as we follow Christ in his ministry, he has very clearly this knowledge that he is moving towards Jerusalem and moving towards ultimately the crucifixion. This is a central piece in the Eucharist, is the sacrifice of the Mass. This is a sacrifice that I think Ruby embodies very well. Ruby's a woman who had lived 15 years in Atlanta, Georgia. She'd worked there, she'd had kids there, her kids were growing up, she was married, And one of her relatives, her mom, got very ill in southern Mexico. And so she moved all the kids back to Mexico. She said, we have to be back with my mom and take care of my mom in her last days. And lived in Mexico for a couple of years until her mom passed away. And then her kids, who were born in the US, had grown up in the US, wanted nothing to do with Mexico. They didn't feel it welcome. They felt discriminated against in the schools. They struggled with learning Spanish. And they wanted to go back to the United States. So Ruby sent them back to the US. She said, I can't hold my kids back from their dreams. And then she was alone in her town, in a small town in Chiapas, where her mom had died, her kids had gone back to the US. She was disconnected from the community, and all that she wanted to do was be back with her children. So she started to try to cross the border. Ruby stayed in our women's shelter now, I think, 4 times in the attempts that she's made to get to the United States. One of the times that she actually made it all the way up to Phoenix, and which usually, for those of you unfamiliar with geography in Arizona, Phoenix is about a 3.5-hour drive north of the border, and it's a point at which there's much less presence of Border Patrol. So usually when people have made it to Phoenix, then they've made it into the United States. And this wasn't the case for Ruby. So she made it to Phoenix, she was in a house. The next day, police officers knock on the door, and everybody who was in the house was arrested and she was deported. The next time she tries to cross the border, she got lost in the desert. She's a single woman traveling alone in the desert. She said, there's nothing that gave me more fear than walking around by myself at night, not knowing where I was going, not knowing who else was out there. And she got detained and she got deported again. And then she tried again to get to the United States. She journeyed for several days in the desert and was detained. And this time she was put in jail for 30 days for having crossed the border again. Because we, as a country, have decided that that's a crime to re-enter after a deportation. And so she was charged with a 30-day sentence. For the first time in her life, was in prison, and then was deported again. And every single time that she was deported, faced this impossible decision of, am I willing to risk this again? Am I willing to make this journey again? But for her, it wasn't just about the suffering. When we talk about the sacrifice of the Mass and the Lord's Passion, we're not just talking about the suffering, but we're talking about a sacrifice. The sacrifice ultimately is for something. In the case of Ruby, she was making this sacrifice for her children. In the case of Christ, he's making the sacrifice for us. So at the moment of this deep suffering, we do lament and we do despair, and we have to let ourselves feel that grief. But we also know that Christ is accompanying us in that grief. I don't think this was mentioned in the introduction, but I first went to the Kino Border Initiative back in 2011. I was at the time still a student at Georgetown University, felt an incredible call to go down to the border, somehow persuaded my parents to support me in that endeavor, and was just overwhelmed in the first month with the stories. The stories I've shared with you have just been a small sample of the stories that we hear on a daily basis. And I would lay at bed at night in tears, and I would say, God, there's no way that you're seeing this. There's no way that you can see the depth of the suffering that's happening here. And every night, God would show me an image of his son on the cross. And he would say, oh, mija, oh, my daughter, I understand in a way that you never will. I understand in a way that's so deep and profound, and I'm with them, and I'm with you in this suffering. So it's not a suffering without hope, but it is a suffering in its depths. And we have to feel its depths and not move on too quickly. Yet we are also a resurrection people. We're a people that believe that there's a fourth week. We don't end the Mass in the middle of the Eucharist. We go out, we go in peace. And for me, the example of that would be Fredis. Fredis was a young man who fled from Honduras. So he was facing persecution in his community because he'd been participating in the Navy, and so the people who were involved in trafficking drugs in Honduras were trying to target him. So he fled up to the border, came to our aid center. His sister actually had already been in the US. Her sister and her kids had already sought asylum in the US, so they were in Virginia. And Fredis came to us in May of last year, and we oriented him to the asylum process. We said, this is an option for you. You will be in detention for at least 6 months, possibly more, and then you might have a chance at bond or not. And he decided to seek asylum. He decided to turn himself in at the port of entry and went to detention. And I remember Fredis in a particular way, almost because I forgot him. Almost because in the day in and day out of work in Nogales, I knew that he was in detention, but it always seemed just a little bit too far to go and visit. Just a little bit too far to have a conversation, just a little bit too far to follow up on how he was doing. Until we had this incredible volunteer who was supporting our attorney, who had the opportunity to meet Fredis and spend time with him and listen to him, far more than just the legal work of his case, but really accompanying him. And she started to tell me, Joanna, we have to do something for Fredis. We can't let him stay in detention. And it was coming up on his bond hearing. He didn't have a sponsor in the United States, so you have to have a US citizen or a legal permanent resident who's willing to write a sponsorship letter in order to even qualify for bond. And he only had his sister, who was an asylum seeker herself. And so it was 2 weeks away from his bond hearing, and we didn't have a sponsor. We had to submit the documents in a couple of days. And I started to scramble and think, who's going to take in a young Honduran man, a 20-year-old Honduran man? It's incredible the hospitality that people have offered to families. It's a lot harder to convince people to offer hospitality to a 20-year-old Honduran man. And so I started calling around and getting no's and no's and no's. It happened that the very next day I was at our board meeting, and one of our members, the members of our board, came up to me and she said, well, Joanna, what could we be doing more to support you? And I thought of sort of an intermediate ask. I said, well, this is really what we need. We need you to go and visit this and do this database for me. And she said, well, that seems pretty reasonable. What else do you need? I said, to be honest, I need somebody to take in a 20-year-old Honduran man into their house, sponsor him while he goes through his asylum process. And she said, well, I think we can probably do that. I should probably ask my husband first. And so she goes home, she asks her husband, calls me and says, well, we'll take him in. And the times that our legal assistant and then myself had visited Fredis, he'd just been in tears. We would walk in and he would cry. He was agonized about his family in Honduras. The very next day when this couple went and visited him, he was also in tears, overwhelmed by their generosity, overwhelmed by the idea that they would take him in, not having known him, not without any background. They didn't even speak any Spanish, but they opened their doors to him because they were willing to. And he was released from detention then. He qualified for a minimum bond, which was $1,500. The day I was going up for his bond hearing, I was talking to a couple of other volunteers in the Comedor. I mentioned that we had this hearing, and they said, well, if it's less than $5,000, we'll write the check for you, Joanna. And so I went up, it was $1,500, I called them, I said, where's that check? And they wrote it, and Fredis was released the very next day. He continued his asylum process in Phoenix, Arizona, happened to be arguing his case in front of one of the most generous immigration judges in the country, who unfortunately just retired a week ago. But so Fredis was released on bond 2 weeks before bonds were taken away by a Supreme Court decision. And he appeared before this immigration judge a month before this immigration judge retired. And he won his asylum case. And now is able to stay permanently in the United States. And this is a photo of Fredis with his pro bono attorney celebrating the victory outside of the courthouse. So it's moments like this, moments in which we have the opportunity to celebrate these wins, celebrate radical hope that propels us forward. It's a hope that's not empty or Pollyannish. It's not a hope that we invent out of wishful thinking. It's a hope that comes through a process of so much suffering. I celebrated with Fredis, but I'll never forget also the times that I sat with him and he was in tears. I'll never forget the agony of when he was at the border trying to make that decision. It doesn't wipe away those elements, but it's through that suffering then that we have the opportunity to experience incredible grace. And God can give us that glimpse of the radical hope of the kingdom and say, this is what my church is pointing towards. This is what the Eucharist points towards. It's a Eucharist that grounds us in tender love, a Eucharist in which we recognize that we're beloved, that we can receive God's hospitality, much like Juana was able to offer so much tender hospitality and love to her family and to others. We live a Eucharist that invites us to accompany Jesus and be inspired by Jesus in his public ministry. Jesus who is with the most marginalized, who understands him them in a deep way. Jesus through our brothers and sister migrants who inspire us with their leadership and example and strength, much like Rocio inspires me. And it's a Eucharist that comes at the expense of great sacrifice. A Eucharist in which we do cry desperate tears and we feel the weight of suffering. But ultimately it's a Eucharist in which we have the invitation to go out and to go in peace. And so I've held you back from action along the journey, but the final step, the final invitation is an invitation into action. It's not an empty action, it's not a reactive action, it's an action well grounded, an action that can live in radical hope and in the recognition that we are always necessary, but we're never sufficient. And there's a certain peace in that, because this isn't, for Fredis and for others, it took an entire community. It took a whole series of miracles. And we have the opportunity or the privilege now of being a community in which we can act as bearers of that hope. So that whether the border is in the physical sense, the US-Mexico border, or whether the border exists in our own communities here in Cincinnati, at Xavier University, in Bellarmine Parish, we can live that hope more radically. So that's my hope for you all this evening. That's what inspires me. And I appreciate the invitation. We at Kino Border Initiative really feel like we're partners with Bellarmine Parish and with Xavier University, that we're on this journey together. So I'm looking forward to figuring out where in this journey are we going to go next. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions and answers, correct, Tim?
Yes, so Joanna is very graciously taking questions. So please line up right here with any questions you might have. Is that working?
Thank you very much for what you're doing, what Kino Initiative is doing, and we do have very much in our hearts the immigrant population. Speaking as a person from a religious community, how do you see, because I know there are other religious communities here, and of course the Jesuit is one, how do you see religious communities as working on the border or working with Kino to help the immigrant?
Yeah, thanks so much for that observation. It reminds me that I left out our most important religious community, which is not actually the Jesuits, but the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist. So the Kino is a collaborative project of the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, which is a Mexican order of sisters, and of Jesuit priests. But the sisters outnumber the Jesuit priests by 1. So they're the stronger community. I think that there's a couple of a number of gifts depending on the precise community. So what I observe, at least at Kino, between the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist and the Jesuits, is that the missionary sisters of the Eucharist have this ability to live in community in a beautiful way that then invites others in with them. So I think religious orders have a particular understanding of community that's very difficult for us lay people, for secular communities to understand. And it allows a certain level of hospitality that's not just a hospitality of one person inviting another in, but really a community growing out from that one particular religious community. I think, so that's one instance that we see with the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, particularly in our work, is that they're able to love and serve not just the migrants who are there, but also the volunteers and also our staff, and also our donors, in a way that makes our work possible. I believe that both the sisters and also the priests have a unique ability also to speak with a prophetic voice and change policy and change public perception in a way that it's more difficult to sometimes as a layperson. That there's a certain level of credibility and platform that religious communities have that allows people to rethink their previous perceptions. So it's not that it can't be done elsewhere, but it's a gift of the religious context. And we see that with communities at the border, we see that with communities in other parts of the United States. And the third that I just have to put in because Pope Francis invited all religious communities to this, but is the opening of doors, the hospitality I've been talking about, of legitimately welcoming in people who are in need of a place to live, and open up the convents in Rome and let the asylum seekers and refugees sit there. There's an abundance of, not that religious communities are wealthy in a money sense, but there is an abundance of connection and resources and space to serve in a way that isn't always possible for those who are living in family life. So those are three observations that I've seen in my work.
Thank you for the work that you do. How has the family separation policy affected your community that you work with?
Yeah, so as many of you are familiar, beginning this in the Trump administration, actually over the course of the year, had been separating families on occasion, but in mid-May began to systematically separate them through what was called the zero tolerance policy, which criminally prosecuted parents who were crossing the border with their children. And the parent would be sent then to jail while the kid was sent to a shelter for unaccompanied minors. Many of the families that we come in contact with who are seeking asylum in the US, we actually meet them before they cross the border. And so we would advise them not to cross illegally, but to present at the port of entry. The less reported part of the story was that the Trump administration was encouraging all these families to go to the port of entry. They said that's the legal way to seek asylum. We had a backlog of 2 weeks where people were waiting for up to 2 weeks to seek asylum at the port of entry. They were stranded in Nogales because the US government was claiming they didn't have enough resources to process people. So we had to set up an ad hoc shelter for, at one point, 100 individuals who were all stranded in Nogales. But we were encouraging these people who were waiting in line not to cross the border and not get separated. But I think so in this very specific sense in Nogales, we weren't accompanying a lot of families that were separated. It was the greatest source of anxiety for parents. I probably had, over the course of just a week, I would have 25 conversations with parents who would come to me and would say, well, will I be separated from my kids? And what will happen if I'm separated from my kids? And I had to tell them, well, this is where it's more likely to happen. This could happen to you. And I remember one mom from Guerrero. Guerrero's a state in southern Mexico that's been very affected by drug violence. There's a lot of heroin production there now, so the cartels have taken over. It's the most violent state in Mexico. She said, but the cartels wanted to take my kids away. And that's why I came. That's why I got on this bus in the middle of a gunfight in my town, is because I didn't want my kids to be taken away from me. And now you're telling me that the US government is going to take my kids away? And it goes back to that complicity, where I had to say I don't support it, but I do have to explain that this is the policy, and I understand that this is the worst suffering that you can imagine as a parent. But she and many others didn't see another option. So even knowing that the risk of getting separated, they chose to move forward because they were going to be separated if they stayed. So it was for us just a layer of cruelty and of anxiety that we had to experience over the course of many weeks. And for our partner groups in the United States who work directly with the children or who work directly with the adults who are in detention, it was an even enhanced level of trauma, as we were working with people who had that anxiety about being separated, but people like the Florence Project were assisting the kids and the parents who already were separated, and to have to go and represent a 1-year-old in immigration court because his mom was in detention elsewhere, it was something that unfortunately burned a lot of people out. There were, in July actually, there was a couple weeks in July where many people from our partner organizations quit in the same time because it just wasn't sustainable emotionally to be able to give that accompaniment. So there are still families who are separated because their parents have been deported. There's still kids who are stranded in the US and who are being supported by these organizations. But I'll end on a more hopeful note, which is that the other thing that we saw was an incredible reaction of solidarity and outrage and activism from communities in the United States that ultimately did turn the policy around. So that was an example of hope. The number of calls that we got, the number of donations, the number of people calling their senators or just reaching out to me and saying, what can we do, reminded us that we weren't alone in that moment. So that was the byproduct of the policy, or more the response to the policy.
I have just a couple of practical questions for those of us who've never been to the border with the Kino Initiative. What kind of infrastructure do you actually have there? You mentioned a shelter for women, and how do people end up in your facilities is one, and then if you could also tell us a little bit about your interaction with the community and local law enforcement. How do those interactions work out?
Yeah, the first two are very practical, and the third is very complicated. The first is, so we had a photo here when it pops up. The mural photo is in our comedor, which is known as a dining room. That's the word for dining room in Spanish. And when I describe it, it seems so much larger than it is. It's maybe the size of this block of pews over here, just the third of this side of the room. But we serve about 70 to 80 meals to people in that space, and then we offer other services like medical attention, clothing. We have another group that comes in and offers phone calls. So that we call our dining room, but really it's our aid center. And then we only have space for women to say we only have a women's shelter. We don't have a shelter for men, though there is another organization that has a shelter for men in Nogales. And the people that we receive in both of those spaces are primarily folks who have been deported from the United States. About 90% of the people we receive have been deported from the US. Of those, about 40% have been living in the US for a long time. Women like Maribel, who many of you know here in Cincinnati or have heard of in Cincinnati. So people who have kids, who have lives in Phoenix or Las Vegas, they get deported. And then 60% are people who are just now crossing the border. And the Mexican government drops them off in Nogales, Mexico, and they're usually not from Nogales, Mexico, and then they have to figure out what to do next. So we're the first place that people are stopping, usually within about a half an hour of having been deported, and come in with their plastic bags and a lot of confusion and questions. That was the first question, was the facilities. The second question was who we're serving, right? Oh, and how do they get there? So then when they get deported, the Mexican government receives them, gives them a piece of paper that says, you've been deported. Essentially, it says their name and the time of deportation, and then says, do you want a meal? And if they say yes, then the Mexican government will drive them over to our aid center. People who are Central American, it's a little bit more complicated. So oftentimes they'll be somewhere in the city of Nogales and they'll be begging for food or sleeping under a bridge, and someone will come along and say, well, have you heard of the place where they help migrants? And they'll point them in the right direction. Sometimes we have people who have come in contact with shelters further south in Mexico, and the shelter will call us and say, such and such family is on their way north, and could you assist them in X, Y, and Z manner? But I would say the more common for Central Americans is just word of mouth and anecdotal, and oftentimes after they've spent a couple nights on the streets, unfortunately. And then the third question was interaction with local law enforcement. So we work in 3 dimensions: humanitarian aid, education, and advocacy. And we do advocacy on both sides of the border. I would say our relationship with the United States authorities is sometimes better than our relationship with the Mexican authorities. So the Mexican police oftentimes will rob migrants when they're on the streets of Nogales. They'll just, for not having identification, they'll take their money or threaten to throw them in jail. It's been very difficult for us to have conversations with the police to advocate on that front. We do have a good relationship with a part of the Mexican government that does more humanitarian relief. It's called Grupo Beta. But then there's the Mexican Migration Institute, which is also trying to detain and deport Central Americans, which we have a much more tense relationship with. On the US side, part of our goal is to try to reform the practices of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, which are the 2 big law enforcement agencies that oversee immigration. And I file numerous complaints against CBP for a variety of matters, such as failure to return belongings or physical abuse, denying somebody the right to asylum. But we have a good personal relationship with the people who are in CBP. So I go out and have quesadillas with them once a month and talk about all the complaints that I have and all the issues, and call them on the phone when we're in a moment of crisis and say, we need you to change what you're doing. And they generally don't listen. They always listen to me. They always hear me, but don't always listen to me. So we have this base of personal interaction and connection, and a lot of people actually who work for CBP, Customs and Border Protection, go to parishes in the area, and so our Jesuit priests will celebrate Mass for them. But we want to move also beyond just a personal interaction and understanding, and say we'd also like you to change what you're doing. That's the next step in relationship, is figuring out how can we move towards acting more humanely and justly. And that's the part that we haven't gotten to, but that's the part that we're trying to get to through advocacy. And there's people that I deeply respect and admire who work for Customs and Border Protection. And there's one supervisor, for example, who, as we've had issues with the port not processing asylum-seeking families, I ran into him while I was crossing the border, and I was talking about how concerned we were about the families. And he stood there and he said, it just really breaks my heart to see that people have to be in this situation, and I'm trying to do the best that I can. And so it's an example of that respect for humanity and dignity, but then also the need for a more structural reflection, that we need really good CBP officers, and we also need CBP to act differently as an agency.
And my question kind of segues off that advocacy. As I listened to your very impressive and humbling for me presentation, it struck me that once again, how much of my federal income tax should I withhold so that I'm not complicit in this system of social evil? That's been part of my life in a way. But more directly, at this particular moment, some bishops in this country have worked so mightily to make us aware of and to try to deal with this. They've become advocates. The episcopacy of this country in general right now have no moral credibility with the average Catholic. I see no way in which they can lead us as advocates in this particular area, because I don't think anybody's listening to them anyway, is where do you see what we need, the voices that are big public voices that can speak the moral truths, call out the moral challenge, and bring us to some Christian resolution to this terrible thing that we are doing to ordinary people and to children?
Yeah, I think it's a really critical question that I'm going to also push back to all of you, because part of this challenge that we're facing as a church is this sense of clericalism or reliance on the bishops and the church hierarchy. And what we need to do is step up as church, as community, and be that force of moral clarity. It's been too long that the USCCB has been very strong on immigration issues and has had clarity on what does it mean to support our neighbors and our brother and sister migrants. And that hasn't trickled down to the parish level, and it hasn't trickled down to the average Catholic level. And so that impetus is on us as church to be reaching out to our neighbors and our communities and speaking from a lens of faith and trying to, in that process, change people's hearts and minds so that they can better understand the humanity of migrants. It's one of the reasons that when I'm looking at a list of invitations of where to go, I try to go to places where maybe you're not hearing quite so much about the border, and maybe the discussion hasn't progressed as much. But there's only so much that leaders can do, and that's the challenge that we're in now, is when leaders don't have moral credibility, it means that we need to be also the leaders of the church. So that's my invitation to you all, is to think in the context of the family separation, for example. It wasn't just pastors and priests and bishops who were outraged that caused that shift. It was ordinary Americans who were seeing these images on TV, who were for the first time understanding the impacts of immigration policy, and who were horrified and who sprung into action. That's what created the change that we saw this summer. And I think that if more people knew and more people were horrified, then we could better promote that change.
Why did you take everything out of my question, except for the fact that as a 78-year-old Jesuit priest, there's not a lot I can do. I mean, I can't lead any organizations or do anything else. I've tried to do that in terms of homeless and everything else, and people here in ministry. But the young people here and the people who are actively engaged in public, in families, and in offices and businesses, could, as I see it, could do some very simple things, such as talk to somebody in the office, talk to somebody you know, talk to somebody you're having lunch with about what went on here tonight, and say, how can we, you and I, do something about this? And put it on them to say, well, I never thought of it that way. And invite them to join you in the work. Because no one wants to do the work alone, but with somebody walking beside me, I'll go anywhere.
It's beautiful. It's I'd challenge you and say it's not just the young people. What the beautiful thing we have the chance to say, and I was intentionally, when I was choosing the people to follow here, so we have Juana, who's 70 years old, Rocío, who's in her 40s, and Fredis, who's 20 years old, and all in different ways are acting in love, all in different ways are trying to promote well-being for their neighbors. In the same way, when people come down to the comedor, one of the first reactions that I get is they say, there's a lot of retired volunteers who show up here. We have a lot of retired people who are helping with the phone calls. And at the same time, we have a lot of high school students who are visiting on immersion experiences. And we have a lot of 20-something people who are supporting through parishes. And so it's an opportunity to work across generations. And it's neither the task of the old nor the young, but as you so well put it, to figure out how can we, in our particular contexts, then reach out to individuals and push others into action. So thank you. I think Tim's signaling one more question.
So kind of stemming off of that, I am from the border. I'm from El Paso, Texas, and everything that's been going on has not only been like just really disheartening, but yeah, just awful. What is there that like not only I as a college student can do? I know there are little things like that you can do to like enact smaller change, but is there anything like you have that we can do on like a grander scale, just as like either college students or as people in general?
Well, for the college students in the room, I'll go really grand, which is I went to a university, and for, love it or hate it, one of the characteristics of Georgetown University is that they have this certain sense of these are the careers that are expected of you, that there's a channeling of this is what it means to use your Georgetown education well, and it doesn't always intersect with the Jesuit values that Georgetown professes. But I think it's probably not unique to Georgetown, where as you graduate college, you're trying to think of, well, how can I be relatively stable or relatively successful? It takes a lot to not have that job set up for you when you're in the fall of senior year. When maybe those of us who go into NGO work, we're not going to know until about 2 weeks before the job starts whether or not we have a job. It takes a certain level of risk-taking to say, I want to commit my life, not just my free time, but my life, to figuring out how can I better live in solidarity with migrant brothers and sisters. And so those of you who are college students have a unique opportunity to do that. Where I went back and forth, so I remember the spring of my junior year, I'd come back from the border, I was an incredible culture shock. And I thought, well, the thing that I have to do is get an internship in DC, because that's the thing that people do when they're coming out of their junior year at Georgetown. And I had a mentor of mine challenge me, and she looked at me and she said, Joanna, if you just go down to the border and love people for the rest of your life, that is not a waste of the gifts and talents that God has given you. And it gave me the sense of freedom of, I don't have to fit into the legitimate career, I don't have to fit into the traditional path, but we can live radically and adjust our career path, which can be a great variety of things. It doesn't certainly mean just becoming an immigration attorney, which I'm not, or just becoming a social worker, which I'm also not, but thinking with variety of making those sacrifices. So that's the big dream, I think. And then another big dream is in the field of advocacy, I think when we talk about advocacy, the word in Latin means to be the voice of. So it implies both standing with people, so getting to know people who are migrants, and then also advocating for their rights. And I think we need to do a better job of linking those two. So we sometimes we'll hear that there's a bill in Congress and people will call their senators and representatives, which you should absolutely do, but without a sense of connection or knowledge of who are the communities that this is affecting. Or people will stand with communities and do service without a sense of connection of how political structures are affecting that. So I think as college students in particular, but also other members of the community, we can bridge those opportunities and really intentionally seek out, even if it is just in the quote-unquote free time or in our non-class time, to think, how can I both be with people, how can I reach out to my neighbors, get to know communities I wouldn't otherwise know, and then do some reflection on how that can lead to advocacy and joining some of the local campaigns and organizing, local in the sense of working on Cincinnati and Ohio issues, but then local also in the sense of pressuring your local representatives who are at a federal level. So that's rather not a complete plan, but at least a framework to think of how to connect those two.
Joanna, thank you super much for being with us, for teaching us about our own faith and calling us to action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.